Hello and welcome to our second lecture under Module 1. And today we will discuss climate change adaptation, basic concepts and approaches. We'll have two topics for this lecture. First, basic concepts, and secondly, approaches to climate change adaptation. So let's begin by defining several important terms that you will encounter throughout this online course. The first term is climate change impacts. These refer to the effects of climate change on natural or human systems. Depending on the consideration of adaptation, one can distinguish between two types of impacts. One is the potential impacts. These are impacts that may occur given a projected change in climate without considering adaptation. On the other hand, residual impacts are impacts of climate change that would occur after adaptation. So note the first one is without considering adaptation, whereas in the first one, these are impacts after adaptation has been implemented. Another term is sensitivity. It is the degree to which a system is affected either adversely or beneficially, in other words, positive or negative, by climate variability or change. The effect may be A, direct, such as, for example, a change in crop yield in response to a change in the mean, range, or variability of temperature. Or it can be indirect, such as damages caused by an increase in the frequency of coastal flooding due to sea level rise. Another important term to note is resilience. It is the ability of a social or ecological or natural system to absorb disturbances while retaining the same basic structure and ways of functioning, the capacity for self-organization, and the capacity to adapt to stress or change. Think of it like a rubber band, where it immediately goes back into its original shape after being changed. Vulnerability is another concept. It is the degree to which a system is susceptible to and unable to cope with adverse effects of climate change, including climate variability and extremes. For example, note that it is a function of the character, magnitude, and rate of climate change and variation to which a system is exposed, its sensitivity, as well as its adaptive capacity. Now, adaptation refers to the adjustment in natural or human systems in response to actual or expected climate stimuli or their effects, which moderates harm or exploits beneficial opportunities. Again, we may classify adaptation into several categories. First is anticipatory adaptation. It is adaptation that takes place before the impacts of climate change are observed, and thus it is also referred to as proactive adaptation. On the other hand, planned adaptation is the result of a deliberate policy decision based on an awareness that conditions have changed or are about to change, and that action is required to return to, maintain, or achieve a desired state. Another term is autonomous adaptation. It is adaptation that does not constitute a conscious response to climate stimuli, but is triggered by ecological changes in natural systems and by market or welfare changes in human systems. And so it is also referred to as spontaneous adaptation. Next, adaptive capacity. It is the ability of a system to adjust to climate change, including variability and extremes, to moderate potential damages, to take advantage of opportunities, or to cope with the consequences. Now, adaptation benefits are the avoided damage costs or the accrued benefits following the adoption and implementation of adaptation measures. We can put this in a formula like this. Vulnerability V is a function of E, exposure, S, sensitivity, and AC, adaptive capacity, including adaptation measures. E, or exposure, refers to the exposure of a system of interest to stimuli that act on that system. So these are climate variability and or the various changes in the climate system, such as temperature increases, rainfall variability and change, or changes in the frequency or intensity of tropical cyclones. Well, S, or sensitivity, refers to the responsiveness, as we have seen earlier, of a system to climate hazards. The more sensitive a system, the larger the rate of magnitude of an adverse response to a given hazard. Sensitivity may vary considerably from one system sector or population to another. And then adaptive capacity, that refers to the ability of a system to change in a way that makes it better equipped to manage its exposure and or sensitivity to climate influences. So these three factors will determine the vulnerability of the system under this equation. Okay, now let's go to approaches to climate change adaptation. This will not be exhaustive. Our intention here is just to give you some idea of what are some of the basic and important approaches that have been used in climate change adaptation. Okay, first let's look at possible adaptation measures. Well, number one, it may surprise some of you, but farmers, fisher folks, and people can simply do nothing. In other words, just bear the losses. If the losses are acceptable, people may actually choose not to adapt. Second, we can share losses among a wider community. For example, extended families who can assist each other so that the loss of each family is less, as opposed to if they would adapt by themselves. Third, we can modify the threat. If there's a degree of control over the threat, for example, flood control can be modified through certain infrastructure. Fourth, we can also prevent the effects. For example, changing crop management, such as provision of irrigation if there's water deficit. Fifth, change the use, such as, for example, changing the crop to a more drought-tolerant crop. And then we can also change location of economic activities, say shifting from one province or state to another. There are basically two approaches to climate change adaptation. First, we will look at the top-down approach, and then next we will look at the bottom-up approach. Now, the top-down approach is most useful by national policymakers, those that are looking at the impacts of climate change on a nationwide scale, whereas the bottom-up approach will be most useful for local communities who want to adapt to climate change. Now, they are complementary. I would encourage you to consider them both because they are both important, and we can use them both to complement each other so we can arrive at a more effective and a more site-specific, but at the same time relevant nationally adaptation measures. So let's begin with top-down approach to climate change adaptation. Now, the first step is to collect and review existing hydromet or observational data, such as temperature, rainfall, wind patterns. Two, choose a global change or climate change model. These are models that can be used to generate future climate scenarios. And third, try out, fine-tune, and localize the modeling process. Step 4, generate climate scenarios to get a snapshot of possible futures. For example, what is the possible temperature in the next 50 years or 100 years? Or what is the possible rainfall in the next decades? And 5, analyze what these scenarios mean for the evolution of risks in the specific sectors of the economy. For example, agriculture or food security, health or natural ecosystems or biodiversity. And then step 6, decide how priority risks can best be addressed, financed, supported by targeted policy action, or this is where we do adaptation. And then the second approach is basically bottom-up approach, starting from local communities, from local governments, and here we want to emphasize no regrets measures. In other words, measures that some would call win-win approaches, things that will be beneficial to local communities no matter what happens. Element 1 of this approach is promoting and anticipating resilient design at the local level. 2, enabling and encouraging adaptive management. In other words, a flexible management approach. Element 3, developing policies that create resilient systems that can easily adapt to various changing conditions. 4, climate-proof human development projects and programs. I have more to say on that in my next lecture. And element number 5, developing national adaptation program frameworks. Here in this slide, I want to show you some of the projects, just an example, just samples of projects that can increase livelihood resilience of local communities. For example, in the emergency management sector, we can develop early warning systems, emergency protocols. For buildings and infrastructure, building codes and certification, ensuring infrastructure is sound, and investment in facilities. For health, preparation for changes in health needs, and also scientific research. For agriculture, we can develop incentives and regulations for improved land management and adaptive changes in farming practices. For forestry, land use regulation and enforcement, including planning, sustainable practices. And finally, for ecosystems, protection of coastlines, wetlands, forests, and other ecosystems. Here's another example of a framework being used by the UN Development Program, and it is called the Adaptation Policy Framework, or APF. In this approach, there are 5 key steps. First, scoping project design. 2, assessing current vulnerability. 3rd, characterizing the future climate-related risks. 4, developing the adaptation strategy. And finally, continuing on the adaptation process. Each of these steps is elaborated in the Adaptation Policy Framework, which you can download from the UNDP website. And then finally, let me just give you a sample of some of the important guidance documents for climate change risk management that have been developed in the last decade. These references, almost all of them, you can download from the internet, and you can use them for your further action. So here we have the technical guidelines for assessing climate change impacts and adaptation. This is by the IPCC. Second is the guidelines for the preparation of National Adaptation Program of Action NAPAS by the UNFCCC. Third is the Handbook on Methods for Climate Change Impact Assessment and Adaptation Strategies by the UNEP. Adaptation Policy Framework, we've seen this earlier. Climate Change Impacts and Risks Management for Business and Government by UNDP and Department of Climate Change, Australia. Adapting to Climate Change, also from Australia. And then Sustainable Regional and Urban Communities Adapting to Climate Change from Australia as well. Adapting to Climate Change, an Introduction to Canadian Municipalities from Canada. Climate Change Adaptation, Risk, Uncertainty, and Decision Making from the UK. And Costing the Impacts of Climate Change, also from the UK. And then Adapting to Climate Variability and Change, a guide manual for development planning from the US. Assessments of impacts and adaptations to climate change on multiple regions and sectors. This is a multi-country study which was supported by START and UNEP. And then Preparing for Climate Change, a guidebook for local, regional, and state governments. And this is from Climate Impacts Group in the US. And there are also a UNFCCC toolkit also available for downloading in their website. And that is the end of this lecture. Thank you very much for listening.